Hello, I'm Jared. I'm one of the Transform workers here. Today's Bible reading is Mark 9, verses 2 to 29, which is on page 1012 in the Church Bibles. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain, where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, "Why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him." When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for one who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "This kind can come out only by prayer."
Thanks so much, Jared. Good evening, everybody. My name's Paul, and I'm one of the ministers here. And I wonder if you've ever mistaken the identity of someone. Maybe you saw them, or were even talking to them, and didn't realize who they were. Well, there have been a number of celebrities who've been mistaken as homeless people over the last couple of years. Some intentionally, some not. And I'd like you to guess. I've got some pictures for you. So we have a little bit of a quiz. Here we go. Who do you think that guy is in the beanie hat? You can shout out. We'll have some interaction. It is Richard Gere. In preparation for Time Out of Mind, a film about homelessness and mental illness, Richard Gere spent time on the streets, and he said, "I was invisible in New York because I was this character. People decided within 2 blocks to see me that I was homeless and didn't look any further. Most had made no eye contact. It was confusing and profound." Here's the next one. Good guess, but no. A British actor. Another good guess, but no. He's a Sir. There we go. Sir Ian McKellen. This one is a little bit more positive. Ian McKellen was rehearsing Waiting for Godot in Melbourne, Australia, and was sitting in his tramp costume having a break when a passerby gave him an Australian dollar. Now, this one is, she's just dressed normally. Who's that? This is 2 years ago. She looks a bit different now, but. It's not Meghan. This is Paris Jackson. And despite being an heiress to the Michael Jackson empire, daughter of Michael Jackson, Paris says she was mistaken for a homeless woman while she was on a set of a photo shoot in 2017. She was one of the first people on set. She was sitting in the parking lot, and a crew member came out to her and said, "Homeless people aren't allowed in this area." She wasn't even in costume. Yet Paris was mistaken. And the question which Mark, the writer of this gospel, an eyewitness of Jesus, is answering, who is Jesus? You see, if you'd lived in a different time and country, you would have seen Jesus. But you could have mistaken him for just an ordinary human being, because he didn't even have a home. So in one sense, he was homeless. He had no dinner plate halo, like in the Renaissance pictures. And many people then had different views about his identity, as they do now. And yet Jesus' identity is a very important question for us to grapple with. He split our time into AD, BC, and as followers around the globe, more followers around the globe than anyone else, over 2 billion disciples. Yet many do not grasp his true identity. And Mark, in this passage, is showing us something fresh about Jesus. Like a diamond, when it has many different facets, you realize different things as you look at it from different angles. So he wants us to realize afresh and in a deeper way who Jesus is, and then the significance that has on our life. So this amazing incident of the Transfiguration shows us who Jesus really is. And the first thing about this is that it claims to show us that Jesus is God in human form. Now, to fully understand what's going on here, we have to go back centuries to in the book of Exodus, where God meets with his people on Mount Sinai. God comes down, and he comes down as a cloud, in a cloud. And he speaks out of that cloud. Here is the voice of God. And everyone is afraid there. And so Moses goes up to the top of the mountain, and then he begs to see God's glory. He says, "Show me your glory, your perfect, bright, infinite greatness, and unimaginable glory." And God says, "When my glory, my majesty passes by, I will put you in the cleft of a rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I'll remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." So Moses is not able to fully see the glory of God. But even getting near was amazing, because after that, Moses' face shone with the glory of God for a number of days. Well, now, centuries on in the passage we read, we're on the top of another mountain. There's the sizzling brightness of glory again. This is not an earthly glory. There's a mountain. There's a cloud. There's even a voice coming out of the cloud. We've even got Moses back. How much clearer can this be? Surely this is Sinai all over again. Well, no, it's not. Because, first of all, there's an astounding difference. You see, Moses reflected the glory of God like the moon reflects the light of the sun. But Jesus produces the glory of God. Jesus is the source of it. The unapproachable and unsurpassable glory of God comes out of him. And what this means is that Jesus does not point to the glory of God like Moses or Isaiah or every other religion or religious founder. Jesus does not point to the glory of God. Jesus is the glory of God in human form. And that, my friends, is an astounding thing. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 says this. Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. The exact representation. There is nothing higher than Jesus in expressing the wonderful, majestic, powerful glory of God. Jesus is the glory of God in human form. And this means he's not just a teacher to follow. Yes, he is that. But he's so much more. Because of this claim which he makes, Jesus has destroyed this middle ground of just putting him in a box. Because if this claim is true, then he can't be just a teacher to be followed. And if this claim is not true, then you have to reject him as a power-crazy, evil deceiver. But if this claim is true, then you can't just follow him. You've got to give him the center of your life, the center of your desires. You've got to make him the focus of your soul's worship. Now you might be thinking, well, hold on. Is this incident the most solid reason that the Gospels give for believing that Jesus is the Son of God? And you know, if miracles aren't a knockdown proof of identity, is this, along with Jesus' claims to be God, is that the best that we've got as Christians? Well, the answer is no. Because this incident points forward to the most solid reason for believing that Jesus was and is the Son of God. And Jesus refers to this here as well, because the Transfiguration gives us a glimpse of the Jesus who would rise from the dead. Look down at verse 8. Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. So no Moses, no Elijah, no cloud, no more transfiguration, just Jesus, as that wonderful carol said, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. Here we are, Godhead veiled again, just looking normal. Verse 9, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man, that's Jesus himself, had risen from the dead. They kept this matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. Now, they would have understood what rising from the dead meant in the Old Testament. The Old Testament says that all people, including all of us here tonight, will rise from the dead at the end of time and will be judged by God as to whether we have lived loving and generous lives or not. But Jesus wasn't talking about that. Jesus was talking about rising from the dead himself within time, within the lifetime of these eyewitnesses. And that's what they couldn't get their heads around at this point. But if we were to read ahead to the end of the Gospel of Mark, you will find that Jesus died on a cross for the forgiveness of our sins, the wrong things that we've thought and said and done, and that he was buried, and that 3 days later, his tomb was empty, and multiple witnesses saw him alive again, bodily, risen from the dead. And that's the way, above all, that God has said to us, this is my Son. And that's what Jesus claimed to be. By rejecting and crucifying him, men were saying, no, we don't believe that's who you are. And by raising him from the dead, God the Father said, you're wrong. He is my Son. And sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with him as your rightful king. So let's go back to verse 9. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they'd seen until he had risen from the dead. Well, why not? Because they'd only fully understand the transfiguration after his resurrection. Because after his resurrection and return to heaven, they'd realize that the resurrection had been a sneak preview, a trailer of the glory that Jesus had now returned to, and in which one day he will come again. My friends, have you looked at the evidence for the resurrection? Because when I doubt, is this really true? And what I want to do in my life is to base my life on truth, as far as I can understand it. And so when I doubt about, is Christianity true, I go through the different arguments. Did they steal a body? Did he not really die? Did he just swoon? But my friends, the best explanation that I've found, however unbelievable it may seem, is that he did physically rise from the dead. Wow. The transfiguration. How spectacular, how awesome. But almost immediately we see how practical it is to these disciples' lives and our lives as well. Because back in verse 2, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to the mountain to see something, to assure them about who he is. And I guess for that time, their doubts and questions would have faded away. And maybe that's your experience when you come here and worship with hundreds of people. When you step out of the kind of everyday life to look at the Bible and at who Jesus is and his resurrection, yeah, it does make sense. Yes, there is solid evidence. It is believable, and doubts and questions, they recede. And church is meant to encourage our faith like that. That's why it's important to gather. But after that assurance of the transfiguration, the mountaintop experience, maybe that's where we get the phrase mountaintop experience from this passage. All too soon in verse 9, they're coming down from the mountain again, and they're plunged into confusion. And maybe that's your experience in your home or your work or your studies. You have doubts and worries. I have that sometimes, especially in my rugby team, when I'm just the only Christian. I think, what? What do I do here? Who am I? Is Jesus really who he claimed to be? And what's interesting about how Mark has put his gospel together is that he often states a truth and then shows real-life incidents of how that truth is worked out in everyday life. And this helps us to think about the relevance of those truths, and particularly today about the transfiguration in everyday life. So after this great experience, there is evil. There's a demon. And what's most interesting about also interesting is that people are arguing. The teachers of the law are arguing in verse 14. And the other disciples who weren't on the mountain, they realize they don't have the ability or knowledge to handle these challenges. And we've got to realize that whilst mountaintop experiences are wonderful, everyday life is basically a journey to the cross. And so my second main point is that transfiguration gives us strength in the midst of trials. Look at verse 11. And they asked Jesus, why did the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Now that's a reference back to Malachi in the Old Testament, Malachi chapter 4, verse 1 to 6, for those who are taking notes. That happened hundreds of years before. And Malachi said Elijah, meaning a prophet like Elijah, would appear to get people ready for when God himself would step into the world in the person of Christ, the chosen one, to make everything right again. So the timetable in the disciples' head would have been something like this. Elijah-type prophet appears. Then Jesus appears, the Christ. And then God's rule is instantly restored and suffering ceases. So Jesus, they would have thought, we don't need to suffer. To which verse 12 then happens. Jesus replies, to be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. And elsewhere, Jesus said that John the Baptist was the Elijah figure who announced Jesus' first coming. So Jesus says, you've got that bit right in the timetable, but read on. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him. He's saying what you've missed in your reading of the Old Testament timetable is that everything isn't going to be sorted out instantly. Everyone isn't going to bow the knee instantly to Jesus as king. He's going to be crucified and then rise from the dead. And that until he comes again, people are going to reject him in every generation because of the freedom he gives to make a genuine choice for him or against him. And then Jesus reminds them of what's just happened to John the Baptist in verse 13. I tell you, Elijah, John the Baptist, the Elijah-type figure, has come. You see, John the Baptist had been killed for his preaching in Mark chapter 6. And Jesus is saying we have to face the fact that if his forerunner was rejected, and if he himself was rejected, then we are also going to experience some level of rejection if we follow him. And Jesus is asking his disciples and to us, why isn't suffering in your way of life? Often when we suffer as Christians, if you are a Christian here tonight, we often question, what are you doing, God? But Jesus is saying, I'm going to go through suffering to greatness. And if you want to follow me, you have to go through that suffering to greatness as well. So when suffering comes, will it make you wiser and deeper and stronger and sweeter? Or will it make you bitter and hard and joyless? And Jesus offers the key, and the answer is worship. If you come off the mountain remembering the reality of who Jesus is and what he's done, if you have that, that will turn you into something great. Now, this is hard, isn't it? Because we think if we're intentional and careful in what we do and say, then we will evade suffering as a Christian. But Jesus said, if they rejected me, they will reject you. A lady who was in university with me decided that she wanted to follow Jesus, and she felt God wanted her to go to Egypt. And I had a message from her last week that one of her friends, who's an Egyptian lady who became a Christian, went to what she thought was a job interview, but it wasn't a job interview. Some Muslims raped her and then killed her and then butchered her. I won't go into the details, but it was horrific. People are suffering for Jesus all over the world. Now, the suffering that we have in our country is not in that way, but it is marginalization. It is pity. Oh, that's good for you, but it's not good for me. Oh, you need it as a crutch. And sometimes when you're following the Lord in what he wants you to do, there is suffering there as well. And we feel this particularly at the moment in fostering. So we've been fostering 2 girls for the last 10 months, and it looks like it's come to the end of that time. And we're doing that because we believe that our God is a father to the fatherless. He looks after the most marginalized in society, and children are in that category. And yet it looks like the girls are going to be split. 2 sisters are going to be split. And it's between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, I'm glad we live in a country where parents have the right to bring up their children, rather than the states just saying, no, we don't agree with what you believe or what you do. If it's safe, parents should bring them back with the right for siblings to stay together. And they have different fathers. They can't go home to their mother. So what's going to happen? I don't know. Maybe one will go home to their father, another one will be adopted, and we'll have to help enable that transition. It breaks our hearts every time foster children leave, and this one's particularly different as well. How do you get through those? Whatever situation you're in, doesn't mean it's going to be easy to follow Jesus. But you have to fix your eyes on Jesus. Fix your eyes on heaven, on where you are going. Else, my friends, you won't make it. But how do we do that? How do we experience worship in everyday life? And I think the last incident in this account gives us 3 insights into that. Let me summarize before we go into the details. The disciples are trying to cast out a demon. But did you notice the last verse and what that tells us? Verse 29. It shows that they're trying to do this without praying. How arrogant that is of the disciples. How clueless are they that they are inadequate to do this in their own strength. They just don't have the strength. And then in verse 14, the teachers of the law are arguing. So you've got the disciples not praying, and the teachers of the law arguing. Only one figure is acknowledged in his weakness, and that's the father of the boy. And in a very memorable interchange, he says, Jesus, will you heal my son? And Jesus says, if you believe. And what does the father say there? He says, I'm riddled with doubt. Will you help me with my unbelief? And then Jesus heals his son. What do we learn? I think there's 3 things. Helplessness, not holiness, is the first step in accessing the presence of God, in having access to the presence of God. Isn't that good news? Jesus does not say, look, I'm the glory of God in human form, so purify yourself. Get rid of all your doubts. Go away and come back when you're sorted and then ask for a healing. He doesn't do that. He is teaching them that following him does not mean that we can say, I have lived a faithful life, now bless me. Because if you say that, that's faith in you, not in him. But the Father is dependent on Jesus. And when we rely on him, then we will experience, my friends, the power of the Holy Spirit. And this is the main difference between Christianity and the other major religions of the world. Because the other major religions say, you need to give God a good record, and then God owes you a blessing. But my friends, because of Jesus, God offers you a perfect record, and then you live for him gladly. The one says, I am holy and faithful, I'm sorted, now bless me. But here's a man who says, I have my doubts, but help me. And Jesus says, yes, I can work with you. So the first step is not holiness, but helplessness. The second one is much more scary. Because if you want to be able to handle the journey of life, and to grow sweeter and deeper and stronger, you need to bring to Jesus your most precious things. Even though it looks like he's going to make things worse. Would you please notice what happens to this father? The father probably had a wife, may well have had other children, but his focus wasn't on them. And I know as a father, if one of your children has a meltdown, it draws all your energy. And I don't know if you've had a family member or a close friend who's been seriously ill or something, and other things which seemed really important before kind of pale into the influence, and that becomes your one thing. That becomes what's most precious. So I think what he's doing is that when the father puts his son into Jesus' hands, he is trusting Jesus with the most precious thing in his life. And what's the first thing that Jesus does? He makes matters worse. When he came to Jesus, he was a deaf mute, but now he's dead. And when Jesus begins to deal with the Father's most precious thing, things get worse. And when I look back at my life of walking with people, often that happens. The people have sometimes said to me, I gave my life to Jesus, and since then it's just been a downward spiral. Things keep on going wrong. I mean, in this situation, it only takes a few moments to realize what Jesus is doing. But in your life, it can take a lot longer. Why would God do that? Well, it's because he knows what's best for you. And he knows that if anything else is your treasure apart from him, it will let you down. Whether it's family or friends or job satisfaction or money or power or sex. All of those things are okay on their own. They're good things, but when they become great things, they are like an icy lake. But as you put more weight on it, it won't be able to sustain the weight that you put on it, and it will just crumble, and you're in despair. But if your foundation is Jesus, then no matter what life throws your way, you can be strong, you can be loving, you can be self-disciplined. You will not be overwhelmed. And then another reason why God puts these things in our life, because he wants us to go deeper with him. He wants his love and his beauty to go from head knowledge to heart experience, and then blissful enjoyment. I'm sure you've had the experience where someone is trying to be explaining something to you about how wonderful it is, and you haven't really been able to grasp it. Maybe it's a great restaurant or something like that. And you kind of acknowledge it, information, but then you go and you taste the food, and you think, wow, it really is great. It is fantastic. And Jesus is beautiful, far better than anything else this world can offer. And then finally, how do we do that? When the cloud came on the disciples, they heard God said, "You, Jesus, are my Son, whom I love." And at the heart of the glory of God is the love of the Father to his Son. Here on the cross, Jesus does not call God Father, as he has done every other time in his life. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" What is going on there? Well, on the mountain of transfiguration, he's surrounded by God. And on the cross, he's forsaken by God. On the mountain, he's embraced with the love and light of God. And on the cross, he's naked and in the dark. Why did he do that? Well, Romans chapter 8, verse 16, there Paul makes a statement which is amazing. It says, "The Spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And it's saying through the Holy Spirit, sometimes you can hear and experience God saying, I love you. You are my child. And if you want to experience more of the love of God, more of the intimacy of God in the everydayness of your life, then think deeply about the cross. When the Father turned away from the Son that he had loved forever. And thank God that we can be embraced forever because the eternal Son was forsaken. What an awesome Jesus we have. Rachel's going to lead us in our response.